The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the silence of the empty house. He wiped his hands on the dish towel and reached for it, expecting perhaps a warm greeting, maybe a question about his day, possibly even an invitation to join them for dinner. Instead, the screen displayed 4 words that would crystallize everything he'd been feeling for months: heat up the leftovers. No greeting. No warmth. Just an instruction, delivered with the casual indifference you'd show to someone whose only purpose is utility. He stood there, staring at those words, feeling something crack inside his chest. This wasn't about food. This was about being reduced to a footnote in his own son's household, about becoming invisible in the very family he'd sacrificed everything to build. The leftovers sat in the refrigerator, neatly packaged in their plastic containers, a physical manifestation of his place in their lives, an afterthought, something to be dealt with when convenient, never quite fresh enough to be served at the actual table. He'd moved in with them 6 months ago after his wife passed, believing family meant belonging, believing his presence would matter. Instead, he'd become the ghost who paid rent, the inconvenience they tolerated, the old man whose existence required nothing more than basic acknowledgement. Tonight, something shifted. Standing in that quiet kitchen, with the fluorescent light humming overhead and the smell of dinner he wasn't invited to still lingering in the air, he made a decision that would change everything. What he did next wouldn't just surprise them, it would force everyone to confront a truth they'd been avoiding, and the fallout would leave his daughter-in-law wishing she'd chosen her words more carefully. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, when Margaret died, he was still a man people listened to, a retired contractor with steady hands and a pension that covered his needs. His son had made the offer gently, almost apologetically: "Dad, you shouldn't be alone right now. Come stay with us. The kids would love it." And he'd believed it was love, not logistics, that motivated the invitation. The first few months felt like healing. He fixed the leaking roof they'd been ignoring, rebuilt the back deck, reorganized the garage into something functional. He'd wake early to make breakfast for the grandkids, pack their lunches with the care Margaret used to, help with homework at the kitchen table. His daughter-in-law smiled then, thanked him even, though there was always something measured in her gratitude, something that felt more like approval of a service rendered than appreciation of a person. The shift happened so gradually he couldn't pinpoint when exactly he stopped being family and became staff. First, it was the assumption he'd handle dinner on nights they worked late. Then it became every night. His pension contribution, initially offered as a way to ease their burden, transformed into an expectation: half the utilities, groceries, his own expenses, never acknowledged in conversation but quietly absorbed into their budget. His son, once attentive and concerned, grew distant, mediated, always deferring to his wife's preferences. The grandkids still hugged him, still called him grandpa with genuine affection, but he noticed how quickly they'd redirect questions to their mother, how his opinions on their activities were received politely and then ignored. He'd become the man behind the curtain, necessary for the machinery to run, but never quite worthy of a seat at the table where decisions were made. He told himself it was temporary, that grief made people self-absorbed, that families recalibrate. But each small dismissal accumulated, each casual disregard layered onto the last, until he woke up one morning and realized he'd become invisible in the only place he had left to call home. The day she got the promotion, the house buzzed with an energy he hadn't felt in months. His daughter-in-law swept through the kitchen that afternoon, phone pressed to her ear, laughing with someone about reservations and celebration plans. His son emerged from the bedroom in a dress shirt he'd ironed himself, something he never did for regular dinners. The kids were instructed to wear their nice clothes, the ones usually reserved for holidays and school photos. He'd showered early, put on his good slacks and the navy sweater Margaret had bought him years ago, the one that still fit well. When he came downstairs, his daughter-in-law glanced at him with surprise that quickly morphed into something else: irritation, maybe embarrassment. "We're heading out for dinner," she said, her tone bright but pointed. "Big celebration tonight. Would you mind holding down the fort?" The phrase landed like a slap disguised as a request. His son wouldn't meet his eyes, just muttered something about the restaurant being small, the reservation tight. They left in a flurry of perfume and car doors slamming, and he stood at the window watching the taillights disappear down the street. He heated a can of soup because he couldn't bring himself to open the refrigerator and face whatever they deemed appropriate for him. Later, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, he saw the photos, his son's arm around his wife, the kids grinning with dessert, a table full of people he didn't recognize, all celebrating a milestone in his family that apparently didn't require his presence. Then her text arrived, sent from the restaurant between courses, casual and commanding: "Heat up the leftovers." 4 words that distilled everything he'd become: not family, not guest, not even human enough to warrant a real conversation. Just the help. Just the man who heats things up and stays out of the way. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that the house they lived in, the one they filled with their noise and plans and celebrations, wasn't theirs. When his son and daughter-in-law bought the property 8 years ago, they were young, ambitious, and financially overextended. The down payment had come from his and Margaret's retirement savings, a gift they'd wrapped in love and expectations of watching their family grow. But the mortgage application had been denied twice under their names alone: too much debt, too little established credit. So he'd done what fathers do, he'd co-signed. Except the bank, seeing his stable pension and decades of credit history, had suggested something simpler. Put it in his name entirely. His son could buy him out later, once their finances stabilized. Everyone had nodded, signed where indicated, and moved forward with the understanding that this was a temporary technicality, a bridge to their independence. That bridge had never been crossed. The deed sat in a folder in his bedroom closet, alongside something else they'd never suspected: records. 2 years of grocery receipts with his card number highlighted. Copies of checks he'd written for property taxes when their accounts ran short. Bank statements showing his pension deposits and the monthly transfers he'd made to cover utilities, repairs, the new furnace last winter. Photographs he'd taken of every project he'd completed: the rewired electrical panel, the restored deck, the kitchen cabinets he'd refaced with his own hands. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't careless. Some part of him, perhaps the contractor who'd learned to document everything, had been quietly building a case he hoped he'd never need. Tonight, staring at that text message, he realized the time had come. While they laughed over wine and dessert at a restaurant he'd helped pay for, he moved through the house with methodical precision. He packed his clothes, his tools, his photographs of Margaret. He gathered his documents into a leather portfolio: deed, receipts, bank records, everything that proved what he'd contributed and what he owned. He drafted an email to his attorney, a man he'd known for 30 years, outlining his intentions with the clinical clarity of someone who'd finally stopped hoping for change. By midnight, his truck was loaded. By 1 in the morning, he'd checked into a modest extended-stay hotel across town, the kind with a kitchenette and weekly rates. And by 2, he'd sent a message to his son, not to his daughter-in-law, never to her again, that simply read, "We need to talk about the house. I'll have my lawyer contact you Monday." Then he turned off his phone and slept better than he had in 2 years. They returned just after 1 in the morning, flushed with wine and laughter, stumbling through the front door with the careless confidence of people who believe their world is exactly as they left it. His daughter-in-law kicked off her heels in the entryway, still recounting some story from dinner to her husband, who mumbled agreement while loosening his tie. The house felt different immediately, though neither could articulate why. Something about the silence, the way it seemed to breathe differently, emptier somehow. She noticed the kitchen first. His coffee mug wasn't in the sink. The dish towel he always left folded by the stove was gone. Small things, easy to dismiss as coincidence until she walked past his bedroom and saw the door standing open, the closet bare, the dresser top cleared of the photographs that had lived there for 2 years. Her breath caught. His son moved past her, confusion sobering him instantly, and that's when they saw the envelope on the dining table, propped against the salt shaker where they couldn't miss it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed with the formality of someone who'd moved beyond emotion into pure procedure. "I've stayed silent while being erased from this family. I've contributed financially, physically, and emotionally to a home where I've been treated as hired help rather than family. Effective immediately, I'm withdrawing my financial support and reconsidering the living arrangement. You'll notice the attached document, the property deed. This house is in my name, purchased with my credit, sustained partly by my pension. I never wanted to use this fact as leverage, but I will no longer accept disrespect in a home I legally own. My attorney will contact you Monday to discuss next steps. I hope you enjoyed your celebration." The second page made her hands shake, a photocopy of the deed, clear and undeniable, showing his name alone in the ownership line. Not joint. Not co-signed. His. The color drained from her face as the implications cascaded. The mortgage they thought they were building equity in, the renovations they'd planned, the security they'd assumed, all of it resting on a foundation they'd never actually controlled. His son sank into a chair, scrolling frantically through his phone, trying to call his father and reaching only voicemail. She paced the kitchen, her earlier confidence unraveling into panic, already calculating what this meant, financially, socially, legally. How would they explain this to friends, to her parents, to the kids? The humiliation of it, the exposure of how they treated him, now documented and witnessed by an attorney. Her promotion celebration, so triumphant hours ago, suddenly felt hollow, tainted by the realization that while she'd been toasting her success, the foundation of their entire life had been quietly dismantled by the man they'd reduced to a text message about leftovers. The conference room was sterile and formal, all glass and polished wood, the kind of space designed to strip away emotion and deal only in facts. His son arrived first, looking like he hadn't slept, eyes red-rimmed and desperate. His daughter-in-law followed minutes later, her earlier defiance replaced by something harder to watch, genuine fear masquerading as composure. The attorney, a silver-haired woman with 3 decades of family law experience, laid out the documentation with clinical precision. Bank statements showing his pension contributions totaling over $60,000 across 2 years. Receipts for property tax payments they'd missed. Invoices for the new roof, the HVAC system, the deck restoration, all paid from his accounts. A spreadsheet she'd prepared demonstrated that he'd covered roughly 70% of the home's carrying costs since moving in, while they treated his contributions as invisible, expected, owed. His son's face crumpled as the numbers mounted. "Dad, I didn't know it was this much. I thought you wanted to help. I didn't realize," his voice broke, and for a moment, he looked like the boy who used to ask his father to fix everything, back when asking felt like trust instead of exploitation. His daughter-in-law's reaction was different. She cried, but there was calculation behind it, a recognition that this wasn't about emotion anymore but about survival. She tried apologies, explanations about stress and miscommunication, but each word landed hollow against the wall of receipts and records. The attorney outlined 3 options with the detached professionalism of someone who'd navigated these family implosions countless times before. First, formal eviction proceedings, which would give them 30 days and destroy whatever relationship remained. Second, immediate repayment of all documented contributions plus interest, which they clearly couldn't afford. Third, a structured settlement. He would retain ownership, they would pay fair market rent moving forward, and he would forgive the past debt in exchange for written acknowledgement of what he'd contributed and a binding agreement about respect and boundaries. His son grabbed at the third option like a lifeline, nodding frantically, promising change. His daughter-in-law's jaw tightened, but she nodded too, cornered by circumstance and her own miscalculations. But he didn't answer immediately. He sat there, looking at his son, really looking at him, and said something that cut deeper than any legal maneuver. "I don't want your house. I never did. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen as more than someone who heats up leftovers and stays out of the way." The apartment was smaller than what he'd left behind, but it was his, a simple 2-bedroom with a balcony overlooking a community park where people walked dogs and children played. For the first few weeks, he simply existed in the quiet, learning to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude. One was imposed, the other was chosen. He joined a woodworking group at the community center, spending Saturday mornings with other men his age who appreciated craftsmanship and didn't need him to justify his presence. He returned to the lake where he and Margaret used to fish, discovering that grief felt different when you faced it on your own terms rather than swallowing it to accommodate someone else's comfort. Old friends, the ones he'd gradually lost touch with during those 2 years of invisible servitude, started calling again. Coffee invitations, card games, the ordinary rhythms of a life that belonged to him. The grandkids visited every other weekend, at his invitation, in his space. Without their mother's subtle orchestrations, he saw who they really were, funny, curious, genuinely interested in his stories. They helped him build birdhouses on the balcony, asked questions about their grandmother, existed with him rather than around him. His son came alone one evening, 3 months after the lawyer's office, carrying apologies that finally felt earned rather than strategic. They talked for hours, not about the house or the money, but about how easy it is to stop seeing the people you assume will always be there. The relationship they rebuilt was quieter, more honest, stripped of the presumptions that had rotted the original foundation. Even his daughter-in-law changed, humbled by consequences in a way words never could have achieved. She sent a handwritten letter, not an email, not a text, acknowledging specifically what she'd done and asking, without expecting, if forgiveness might someday be possible. He didn't answer immediately, because some things require time, but he kept the letter. Standing on his balcony one evening, watching the sunset over the park, he realized something profound. The day he walked away wasn't the day he lost his family, it was the day he remembered he was a person worthy of respect, not just roles and functions. Dignity isn't something you beg for or negotiate. It's a boundary you enforce, even when enforcement costs you everything familiar. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, taken for granted by people you've sacrificed for, or struggled to set boundaries with those you love, you're not alone. Share your experience in the comments below. Let's build a community where people's contributions are seen and valued. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, send them this video. Sometimes the stories we share become the permission others need to reclaim their own dignity. Subscribe for more stories that matter.